Thought I'd start out with a picture of the enemy. This is the new improved Trench Digger 2000. It is Y2K compliant, and this will be operating. Yeah.
I'm glad we used this one.
My slides are actually online, however, the hyphen in the URL is in the wrong place, apparently. It is NANOG 16-Y2K status.html. Page down? Okay. Yes, our corporate communications department did go overtime on this. Our legal department also went overtime on this, so let's hear it for the lawyers. This is official year 2000 readiness disclosure in accordance with the U.S. public law, blah, blah, blah. Any Y2K presentation would not be complete without the standard SCARE statistics. This is the latest Gemini survey that was, I think, about 2 weeks ago. And they surveyed a whole bunch of corporations, and they came up with a figure of 22% of large companies do not expect to have all their critical systems ready by January 1. And that's actually up from the last time they did this. The previous one was 17%. And Gemini claims that 72% have already encountered failures. What's interesting is if you go around and talk to all the industries, the telephone industry, the electrical industry, pipeline, airline, whatever, everyone says they're going to be ready and there's going to be very little chance anything goes wrong, but if something goes wrong, it's going to be someone else. So they all say they have a very low chance of failure in their systems, but there's a moderate to high probability of failure in. Well, if you're in the electrical industry, they say it's in the telephone industry. If you're in the telephone industry, they say it's going to be in the electrical system. So no one really quite knows. What about the Internet itself? Well, apparently there's this big belief that the Internet Society said that the Internet has no year 2000 issues. There are several folks in Washington, D.C. that are absolutely convinced of this. I went to the Internet Society webpage, and they do have a year 2000 statement, but it was mostly speaking about protocols, and I think the next talk is about the IETF working group, and they'll cover that. What I've also found interesting is many other industries are now using the Internet as the primary method for distributing their Y2K information, even though most of those industries have no idea how the Internet works or anything about the Internet's own Y2K preparedness. I also went around looking at a few favorite things that we know and love, giga switches, ATM switches, and yes, people have AGS routers. And those are all three of those are examples of where vendors have said that there are Y2K issues with them. So giga switch, we're stored, you can say sorry. The AGS router, Cisco says buy a new one. ATM switch, the AT&T Lucent switch apparently has some firmware issues. So even though the IP protocols seem pretty good, the stuff we use to run over them all have issues, as they say. We're not quite sure if they're going to break, but they have issues, so lots of folks are replacing those. And if you haven't upgraded your giga switch, it's just a firmware upgrade. You got to get a new firmware from a Cabletron. AGS, you got to get a new Cisco router, although the AGS probably will work. And the ATM switch, like Chicago, Ameritech replaced their ATM switch. The other question is about internet-wide services. Who is DNS or just general exchange points and inter-provider connectivity. And of course, the internet is an industry now, so we're going to blame our problems on other folks. So we say our biggest concerns are probably electrical and telephone and cookie vendors. Real quickly, lots of folks are putting out Y2K press releases. Important thing to remember is the press releases are about fixed systems. No one puts out a press release saying their systems aren't Y2K ready. The other important thing is a lot of them are saying that they have tested and it's completely successful, and there were no Y2K issues found on the tests. Except what they don't usually say is that that was often the second or third or fourth test before there were no Y2K issues. Last month the FAA flew a couple of planes around Denver and declared Y2000 readiness, except that turned out to be the fourth time they tried that test. I'm not quite sure what happened to the previous 3 airplanes. The telco industry has also announced that they're Y2K ready. NANOG 16-Y2K said. We got it working over here. The other thing is about people are announcing that the vendors are announcing that all their systems are year 2000 ready. A lot of these available systems are available only a few days before the press release, and ordering through your sales channels can be challenging. And no one is doing inner testing with a mix of systems. All the tests are being done on 100% test beds that use all Y2K ready systems. Why do I need a contingency plan? Well, all my systems are Y2K ready. Why do I need a contingency plan? Well, if you accidentally miss something, even though you did due diligence and all those great lawyer words, you might have missed something, or something else might have happened that day anyway, like our Mr. Backhoe friend. They still will be operating on those days. The important thing to remember about contingency plans is it really doesn't matter what caused the problem. The purpose of the contingency problem is to deal with the consequences, not the causes. Or as folks might say, the goal is to get the lights back on, not fix the power plant. And I actually wrote that sentence before last week when we blew up the power plants in Serbia. And they're doing a pretty good job of getting the lights back on, even though they don't have power plants. What makes Y2K planning different? If you have already done your contingency planning, most of these things are familiar to you. But if you haven't, these are some of the things you need to be aware about that are different for contingency planning for Y2K. Your natural disasters and your general backhoe problems are pretty random and pretty well distributed around the country. So the most common way people do contingency planning is if a hurricane hits Florida, we'll just move the operations to California. If an earthquake hits California, we'll just move operations to New York. What happens in New York? If something happens in New York, we'll move it to Toronto. Problem with year 2000 is more than likely you're running the same equipment everywhere. So if there is a problem, it will occur everywhere at essentially the same time. Year 2000, well, if it has any effects, it will probably affect both your primary and backup systems at the same time. So just having a ComDisco contract with a hot standby site somewhere, your backup systems may have the exact same problem. Year 2000, even if there aren't any big problems, there could be lots of little problems that overwhelm your response mechanisms. Even if you don't lose a single OC-192, if you just have thousands and thousands of your customers who can't authenticate through Radius or something like that, and they all call your call center at the same time, you'll be swamped. And anyone who has ever had to deal with a clock problem, your NTP server decides to jump forward a few days or whatever, and then you try and fix it by sending it back to the correct time. It turns out to be very difficult to fix because you have logs with the wrong dates in them, and you have stuff that depends on those dates. And if you've ever had to run something like make to compile stuff that's changed, make will often compile the wrong things because it will get the dependencies incorrect. It will say that, oh, since this was last changed in August of 2038, I don't need to change it, don't need to recompile it. And public concern. Public concern is probably the most likely event. People are all going to try and make their phone call all at the same time just to see if the phones will work. And the net result of that is the phones will probably not work. The phone company is very concerned about that, and in the next few months you will probably see several major advertising campaigns to encourage people to make phone calls on other days, just so that everyone doesn't pick up the phones at the same time and see if they have dial tone. Oh, and I mentioned the daylight savings time thing. This clock problem happens to us twice a year for most of us, and those who don't actually change the daylight savings time don't have this thing. But most recently, Walt Disney World, all their cash registers crashed last April when daylight savings times went into effect because they had installed brand new Y2000 ready cash registers, which were apparently not daylight savings time ready cash registers. So contingency planning is good for lots of reasons. This is a fun question. How long is midnight? It turns out local time zones are set by governments, and governments have politicians, and politicians do stupid things. This island, who changed their name, it used to be called the Christmas Islands, but apparently Christmas Islands is one of those nasty things the English gave the name to it, so they changed it back to the original native name, and I cannot pronounce that. Kitchemarata, something like that. Changed their local time zone so they would be the first ones. So they are now UTC plus 14, which is an interesting software problem because it turns out a lot of software only goes UTC plus 12. Contingency planning. Midnight, January 1st actually arrives 5 a.m. East Coast time in the United States, in Kitamaran, the Christmas Islands. The current thinking is they believe they have a Nortel DMS 100 switch for that country. So Nortel is apparently going to be the first ones to get the call, except if the switch is down, I don't know how they're going to make the call. The last country is Samoa and Niue. Well, Samoa is a country, and Niue is another country. They're at UTC minus 14, so this actually goes all the way until 6 a.m. East Coast time. So you have a total of 49 hours of midnight around the world, or 50 hours because there's actually another 7.5 degrees until you reach the international dateline. And I was looking up, and Randy Bush is actually the secondary domain name server for both these countries. So his name server will be the first and last name servers in the world. But the big question is, will network problems follow the sun? So if New Zealand goes down, will we get an early warning, or will network problems travel at the speed of light? So at 5 a.m. Eastern time, well before anyone has opened up their standby contingency plan NOCs, some BGP nastiness comes in from New Zealand, then we're history. Okay, assumptions. You know what they say about assumptions. What could go wrong within reason? What would it do within reason? And what alternatives exist within reason? You basically want to identify the risk, identify your triggers, because the hard thing about contingency planning is not identifying the risk, but identifying that you have the problem when you have it. When the power goes out, how long after the power goes out should you actually activate your contingency plan? If you have UPSs, you may not activate your contingency plan on every single millisecond outage, because the UPS will just ride right through that and you'll be back up. And, but if the power is out for more than 10 minutes or more than an hour or something like that, you might want to start thinking about putting triggers in to activate further backups. What would it do? You need to come up with probable planning scenarios. things that are reasonably could go wrong, and a credible worst-case scenario. Anytime you're doing contingency planning, the most important thing is prioritizing or triage. You won't be able to fix everything, so you pick the most important things and you fix those first. And you need to pre-identify what procedures and facilities that you will think are available for you. Otherwise, you end up with the famous Al Haig statement, "I'm in charge here." And it turns out that the Constitution says that it was actually the Speaker of the House. For planning purposes, what kinds of things could go wrong? Of course, since we're the internet, we're going to blame other folks, the utility companies, environmental, HVAC, voice. But the more interesting things are unusual traffic loads. Everyone comes on and checks the CNN page to see if there's any problems, so CNN goes down. I say things like unreachable internet-wide lookup services like Whois and Root. I put in Whois, and Mark will probably run to the microphone and say that Whois will be ready. So I changed that to unreachable. Even if NSI is ready, there are a lot of folks you have to go through to get to NSI. So it may still be unreachable. So if you have a problem, how are you going to look up someone's phone number? You do a Whois. Network management, it turns out routers themselves don't have a whole lot of date-dependent stuff in them, but network management systems have a ton of date-dependent stuff in them. And cron jobs will fire off and reload your routers and do all kinds of nasty things depending on what patches you have on your operating systems. Or woe to you if you have NT.
Actually, that has nothing to do with Y2K.
Yeah. But if there is a problem, more than likely you're going to be calling folks. So inter-NOC communications failures are probably the key issue, which I'm going to concentrate on the rest of this talk about. I came up with a probable scenario that partial loss of contact information and a partial loss of primary communications. Why is that a probable scenario? Because that happens just about every single day of the year. On Saturday I was here and I arrived and a person invited me to dinner and I couldn't get to dinner, so he called our NOC and asked the NOC to page me. And it turns out my beeper had broken on Friday, so I didn't bring a beeper with me. So they couldn't get a hold of me. So every day of the year we have partial loss of primary communications. So this is probably a fairly safe probable scenario. On January 1st we're going to have the exact same problems we have every single other day of the year. Credible worst case, well, lots of stuff could go wrong. People are a critical resource, and when you're doing a contingency plan, I read a lot of contingency plans which just basically assume that your people will be there permanently. They won't leave and go home and check on their families, and they won't sleep, and they won't eat, and they won't use the bathroom or whatever. When you're doing a contingency planning, you have to remember that people need to do other things than save your ass. So you need to plan for the fact that more than likely your staff will want to check on how their family is doing. So assume that you need to rotate your staff off so they can go home and check to make sure everything at home is okay. You need to prepare a list of personnel contact information, including escalation procedures. You need to decide who will have the authority and the responsibility. And this is not necessarily the standard people. You need to have the people with the authority that you can get a hold of. Just saying your CEO has authority may not do you any good if your CEO, like some of the airlines are planning to do, they're going to put their people on airplanes and have them flying. Unfortunately, that is the last place in the world you want to have the person with the decision-making authority during a time they need to make a decision. The Qantas Airlines, the chairman of Qantas Airlines has already announced he will not be flying that night. He will be in their operations center in case they need to make a decision. That brings the next point. You need to assign individuals with technical experience with the service. Your CEO may not be the best person to make the decision, although you probably don't want to tell him that. And stakeholders. Stakeholders is just a government term for like everyone else, customers, peers, press. What goes into a contingency plan? Like I said, you need to decide who will be in charge ahead of time so you don't end up with the Al Haig problem. You need to prepare to minimize any impacts of a failure ahead of time. If you try and go buy a backup generator today, it will arrive in February. The back order on large generators right now is that far. You need to identify activation triggers. It turns out one problem they have found over and over again with contingency plans when they go and do the post-mortem is that people actually never activated them because they didn't know they had a problem. So you cannot have activation of your trigger plan necessarily be your NOC, call your network engineer saying we have a problem, because if your contingency plan is that the NOC loses communications, they will not be able to call your network engineers to tell them they have a problem. So you need to somehow arrange your triggers. So perhaps your network engineers will call or check in with the NOC occasionally, and if they cannot reach the NOC, perhaps there's a problem, so they should go do something. Reactive steps. This is important because generally folks, the person first on the scene are going to be people already there, and they need to know what they need to do right away. These are your peoples in your COs or whatever. And you may take different steps depending on the length of the failure, so you should map those out ahead of time. Returning to normal operation, that sounds like a simple thing, and people leave that out of a lot of contingency plans. It turns out returning to normal operations is when a lot of the failures occur, when they turn off the backup generator and the automatic transfer switch does not transfer back. And finally, the last thing every single contingency plan must have is a graceful going out of business statement. I got this idea not because I thought of it, but I got this idea reading a contingency plan for a hospital. If you're running a hospital, you do not want the hospital to go out of business while you still have patients in intensive care. So every hospital contingency plan includes a going out of business plan where they transfer their patients or their customers, depending on how you want to view it, to another hospital. So a provider may want to think about how they would do a graceful shutdown. And actually, Patrick Gilmore has experience with this.
Thank you so much for pointing that out.
What alternatives exist? I'm going to go back to our inter-NOC communications failure because I kind of feel that's, since we don't really know what will happen, communications between NOCs will probably be the most important thing to figure out what is happening. The question is what is our primary method of contacting other NOCs? Do we normally call them on the phone or do we normally send them email? So we already have two methods of reaching other NOCs. When one fails, we can use the other one. The question is, how independent are they? If the phone goes down, I have seen real contingency plans that say, if the phones are not working, we will fax them. Although this is technically, it could be possible, and there are systems where you could do this. This was not one of them. Pagers, cell phones, same kind of thing. If our phones are down, we'll page them. If the phones are down, how are you going to page them because you can't use the phone to call the pager company? Cell phones, some cell phones will work if it's your phone system that's down, but if the cell phone is routing through the same central office that you are, your cell phone may not work. Email, same thing, tandem things. What you may find, the tandem thing is we may have to end up playing a game of telephone tag. It may turn out that I can't call North Carolina, but someone in Virginia can call North Carolina, so you may want to play that kind of game. You call Virginia, and Virginia relays the message down to North Carolina just because of some weirdness. Things that you want to do ahead of time. you probably want to get an offline contact list, print things out from WHOIS, even though the WHOIS now says you can't print things out. You want to make a list of your backup and escalation contacts. Most NOCs have a backup NOC somewhere in the country, but they don't tell anyone the phone number of the backup NOC. So I'm not quite sure how you reach the backup NOC when the primary NOC is not available. In addition to other ISP NOC contacts, you also want to get your voice and data contacts. I've discovered that with all the mergers, there are often multiple NOCs within companies that do not know how to call each other or contact each other. No, I won't give any names. And vendor contacts. Everyone knows the 800 number for Cisco's TAC here in North America. You might want to go to the Cisco webpage. They list all the direct dial numbers for their TACs around the world. And you might want to just print that off so you have it. And I picked on Cisco. Do that for your various vendors. Mr. Murphy is an amazing individual. He manages to find your weakest point. So if he comes around and gets you anyway, you're going to go ahead and execute your contingency plan. You also want to notify folks that you are doing it. One of the major problems is a lot of providers will be very diligently fixing things, but they won't tell anyone they're fixing things, so everyone else gets real worried and starts doing things that makes the problem worse. So you want to notify the appropriate stakeholders. There's that government word again. That means your customers, your peers, and anyone else who might have an interest. You need to monitor your recovery progress. It turns out while you're doing your recovery, other things may also happen which change your priorities. So you need to be able to pull people off of whatever they're fixing and move them to a higher priority thing. So you need, once you activate your contingency plan, it is not necessarily to fix the one thing you originally started on. You need to continually monitor it throughout the entire thing. And like any type of plan, it will never survive its first contact with the enemy. So you need to have flexibility. And that means you need to have people with authority to make decisions. If they need to go to Radio Shack and get the part, just because your accounting system is down and they can't get a PO authorized, they should still be able to get the part. And finally, minimize damage. This part, the internet is not so good at. Every provider is real good at trying to fix their own stuff, but while fixing their own stuff, they're more than happy to damage everyone else on the net. We've seen this time and time again with various BGP problems, where people blast things out in BGP and then they'll try and fix it, and it turns out that we have these bogus routes just flying around the network, and it takes a few days to track them all down and kill them all. So you need to minimize damage. And minimizing damage may include that you may need to turn off some of your services to keep them from contaminating other folks. Real quickly, conclusions. Lots could go wrong, but we don't know what. But my prediction is, even though my very second slide said I wasn't going to make a whole lot of predictions, that January 1st won't be that different. But even if it's not that different, we have problems every day anyway. So every operations plan should have a contingency plan. Another conclusion is heightened public interest may magnify any problems. This is what I think the most likely problem will be, and the way you avoid that is you communicate with your customers and with the public. People are less likely to panic when, well, I went in a little bureaucratese, but the Red Cross has found that when people think that someone is there with a plan, they tend not to panic. And actually, I found this too. I'm a volunteer marshal, so I do parades and things like this, and people are amazingly cooperative. You tell them to get out of the street on the sidewalk so the parade can come through, and if you say it in a way that it sounds like you know what you're doing, they will generally do it. If you say it in a way that sounds like you don't know what's going on, they will generally go off and do something else. And dealing with the unexpected will probably require you to talk to people that you've never talked to before. So you need to have some method of ad hoc communications. You can't just say, well, I can't find your customer number, so we won't take your trouble ticket. Yeah, you've heard that talk before. And I'm going to try and get Elmer here working again. Yeah. And go ahead, put it up. Our PC has gone to sleep. Okay. Some of you may have remembered this. The Internet Manager's Phone Book was actually put out a number of years ago, about 9 years ago. And although NSI claims that they own all the Who Is data, it was originally put out by Bolt, Brackman, and Newman. And in here, of course, we have the copyright notice, BBN. So I'm not quite sure who actually owns this. So I'm not sure who to ask for permission. I'm driving the poor machine crazy, so I'll just flip to a page. But this actually went through and printed out all the information for all the contacts, including their phone numbers and email addresses and things like that. And what's nice about it is it's offline. You can carry it with me. And as far as I know, this does not have any year 2000 problems. I believe this book will continue to open and flip and turn. The only problem is it's out of date. Yes, Steve Feldman is working at BT TimeNet.
Sean, there are vendors who sell CD-ROM copies of the Who Is data, so you could buy one of those.
Unfortunately, I don't know if they're using Y2K compliant software for those CD-ROM. I work with libraries. I like paper. And I'm done with that, and I'm ready for questions or harassment or whatever. I was thinking of saying something particularly aggravating to get people to ask questions, but
Phil does his ITF.
Or do you want to put them together?
Yeah, we'll put them together and take
Okay.
questions out once. Okay, Phil? Well, actually, I was thinking, do you guys want to wait and we'll have the ITF, your Y2K, then we'll have like one big Y2K question session?
Well, this isn't so much a question. I can't contain myself.
Sorry.
Right next door, right now, there's a presentation by a company explaining how to sell products on the internet by email.
Okay.
There are more of us than there are them.
Let's get them.
We could take them.
Christian Exodus. Sean, one thing I didn't see on your presentation, I did have to step out for a minute, was the amateur radio. I mean, has any company ever thought of maybe putting a ham station at their site?
Okay.
Emergencies you can.
Alternatives. Yes, there is the amateur radio question, and it does turn out there is that little FCC exemption in there for emergencies and disasters and safety and life and stuff like that. The government actually operates a big radio network that all the telephone companies are on. Actually, the government thought all the telephone companies were on, and then all these other telephone companies showed up. The government thinks all the phone companies means Bell Atlantic, 9X, Pac Bell, US West, and folks like IXC and TCG and Rochester and all those folks aren't on it. So there are radio networks that do that. The problem is the radio networks tend to only connect people who you really don't care about. If any set of ISPs want to do the ham thing, they can. It just turns out that there are a lot of ISPs who do have ham licenses, but there are an amazing number of people who thought Morse code was ridiculous and went in the internet, and even though they dropped the Morse code requirement, they've never got their license. So the alternative is to try and get some other FCC license. But yeah, that is an alternative, and there are folks trying to do that.
Okay. We'll perhaps do a round of questions in a second. Dr. Phil?
Yeah, I just have one comment on that, Steve,
Okay.
HGT. The FCC licensing requirements with him, I'm not sure internet outage would constitute emergency in the FCC's eyes. So I wouldn't really suggest going the ham route.